Hello from Jerusalem and welcome to Bet Avichai. This is our second session with Rabbi Elhanan Miller, who is a journalist, a Middle East expert, and also teaches Jewish studies at Pardes Institute. Together with Elhanan, we're following the last Jews of the Middle East, and today we're in Syria and Egypt. Elhanan, we're ready to hear about them.
Thank you very much, Tamar, and welcome back to all of you, the viewers of the Beit Avichai podcast and the Beit Avichai channel. Welcome to the second session of our series titled, sadly, The Last Jews of the Arab World. As Tamar mentioned, today we are going to talk about two other ancient communities where Jews lived for millennia, the communities of Syria and of Egypt. But before we delve into these two communities, I want to just recap what we spoke about last time briefly. I presented the rationale behind this project that I started 3 years ago called Jews of the Middle East, Yahud al-Sharq al-Awsat, as a project that has basically a dual purpose. The first purpose being documenting, maybe an inward-looking purpose, if you will, of documenting the stories, the dialects, the language, the history of Jews living in communities that no longer exist or are on the verge of extinction today at the beginning of the 21st century, as a project meant for us, the Jewish people, to document the stories and the histories that came out of our people. The second purpose, which I mentioned, was an outward-looking purpose, which was to explain Israel and the complex and intricate Jewish society that lives in Israel to our neighbors in the Arab world, the Arabic speakers, both Muslims and Christians, and show them a more complex and a more, I would say, complicated story of what Jewish society is in Israel, far from being just a Western colonial outpost as it's sometimes presented in the Arab world. It's actually a very diverse society with both Western and Eastern European and Middle Eastern Jews who came here for positive reasons as well as negative reasons, both because they wanted and dreamt of Zion and dreamt of the land of Israel, and also because of persecution. And there is in the Arab world, I would say, generally speaking, an idealized idea of what Jewish life was like under Muslim rule. Now, Muslims ruled this area through various dynasties, Turkish dynasties and Persian dynasties and Arab dynasties for the past 1400 years, roughly, since the beginning of Islam. And this idealized vision or narrative always went that Jews had a lovely life under Islam as a minority, and suddenly Zionism came around and Jews suddenly decided in some way to betray their societies, to betray their governments, and move to Israel or support Zionism. Now, of course, this story has some grain of truth, but there is a very large story behind it that is never told, which is the fact that Jews didn't always have it so well in the Arab world. It really varied from country to country, as we started seeing last week when we spoke about Yemen and Iraq. But there were times of persecution, of suffering, of inferiority that happened centuries before Zionism even began. We're talking about the 19th century and earlier, and in the Middle Ages, of course, and today we'll see a few more examples of that. But in any case, I see great usefulness in presenting these stories in Arabic to the Arab world, something that really surprises and educates a lot of audiences in those countries. Now let's talk about the two countries that we want to deal with today, Syria and Egypt, and we'll start with Syria. The picture I selected, this photo I found online for you today, I think is fascinating. It shows a wedding in Aleppo in 1914, a Jewish wedding, of course. And I think it's so expressive and so informative about the story of the Jews of Syria. We have the Hebrew background in an inscription that looks like a parochet or some sort of perhaps artifact, maybe religious artifact in the back. But in the front we see people dressed in European clothing. The men are clean-shaven with mustaches. The women, their head is uncovered. And in the foreground, in the front, we have a man wearing a fez, a Turkish fez, the traditional Ottoman headgear that people wore in the Ottoman Empire. And here we have a photo really from the very, very last years of the Ottoman rule over this region, over the Levant, Palestine as it was called, or Eretz Israel, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon. It was the Turkish Ottomans who ruled over these lands for 400 years, from 1517 until the end of World War I in 1917, 1918, when the Ottoman Empire lost the war to the Western Allies. And here we have Jews, as you can see, very assimilated, or at least dressed in the European clothing, very far from the image we sometimes have of very traditional Jews. The image we actually saw in certain countries like Iraq in the previous centuries, and Yemen till the very end of the Jewish existence in that country. So this is to highlight that every country had its own experience. And not only did every country have its own experience, even every city within countries had their own cultural life, their own unique experiences. And I think Syria is a great example of exactly that. So let's start with the history of Syrian Jews before we watch two of the videos that I took of Syrian Jews today. So evidence of the Jewish community in Syria dates back to the Second Temple period. When we look at Hellenistic Jews that lived, in Egypt, like Philo and Josephus, who wrote histories of the Jewish people. Josephus, for example, dedicated his book, The Jewish War, written in 73 CE, in the Common Era, to the Jews of Antioch, a city in Syria, who, as he said, were allowed to live there in safety by the heirs of King Antiochus. When we talk about King Antiochus, of course, in the 2nd century BCE, who we celebrate or mention in the story of Hanukkah, the harsh treatment of the Seleucid kingdom, the Greek Seleucid kingdom, but that ruled from what is today Syria. So the descendants of the Jews in that period were actually allowed to live in freedom, unlike the Jews during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, that king that caused the celebrations that we mention, that we mark in Hanukkah. The main communities in Syria that we know of lived in two centers, Damascus and Aleppo. And of course, Aleppo maintained the most accurate Jewish manuscript of the Jewish Bible, known as the Aleppo Codex, although it was probably written in Tiberias in the beginning, the first half of the 10th century, around 920 or 930 CE. But Syria and the land of Israel were one sort of continuum in most of the dynasties that ruled there. And when we talk about Jews in Syria, we can't ignore the general context of what Syria was for Islam. And Syria, in fact, was the first real Muslim empire very shortly after the life of the Prophet Muhammad. There were 4 heirs to the Prophet Muhammad, known as the Rashidun, or the righteous heirs to Muhammad, the righteous caliphs. And starting from the year 661 CE, so only about 25 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, or 30 years roughly after his death, the capital moved from the Arabian Peninsula, from Medina and Mecca, to Damascus. And that's where the Umayyad dynasty ruled. The first caliph, his name was Muawiyah. He was a caliph for 20 years until about 680, and his descendants continued to rule over the entire Islamic kingdom of the time, which was continuously expanding both east and west until the year 750, when the Abbasid empire, caliphate, took over from it in Iraq. So Syria became a very important center, not just for Islam, of course, but also for minorities living there, including Jews. And Jews thrived in those first centuries of Islamic Arab rule in Syria. And we have all these accounts of travelers from Jewish European travelers, both from countries like France and Italy and Spain, describing the Jewish communities of Syria. And one of the most famous ones is, of course, Benjamin of Tudela, who arrived in Syria in the early 1170s, so 1170 and soon after that. And he describes the Jews in Syria as people who were involved in commerce, as Jews who worked in dyeing fabrics and in glass manufacturing. And of course, he reported their business. Later on, in a letter that Moses Maimonides wrote, probably around the same time, the end of the 12th century, wrote to the rabbis of Lunel in southern France, in Provence. He writes that Aleppo is really the only, Aleppo, that city in northern Syria where one of the largest Jewish communities lived. He writes that Aleppo is really the most serious learning center in the whole land, spanning from the land of Israel up into Syria. So even including the land of Israel, Aleppo was still the most serious center of scholarship, according to Maimonides. And that says a lot. It tells us that probably in those years, in the 12th century, the center of learning moved north from the ancient centers of learning in the land of Israel into Syria, which was a much more prosperous community. Even though Maimonides himself, as we know, at the end of his life, he moved to the land of Israel from Egypt, but nevertheless, that was maybe a choice motivated more by ancient Zionism, if you will, or the yearning for the land of Israel more than the land of Israel being a serious center of learning. The Spanish poet Yehuda el-Kharizi, also the beginning of the 13th century, specified in his visits to Syria names of doctors and Jewish officials that he met during his visit in the early 13th century, I think around 1210. In the 16th century, well, before the 16th century, we have to talk about this influx of Sephardi Jews that arrived in Syria following the expulsion, the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews of Spain in 1492. So that was really the second wave of Jewish arrivals in Syria. And in the subsequent decades, during the 16th century, we had this whole wave of Sephardi Jews that moved to Syria. And the most prominent of them were these two students of the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who the famous Ari, the Kabbalist from Tzfat. And those two students were Rabbi Chaim Vital, his maybe most prominent student of the Ari of Tzfat, and Rabbi Israel Najara, the famous poet and writer who wrote famous songs, Zmirot, like Yaribon Olam, Ya'ala, Ya'ala, Boi Legani, Yoducha Ra'ayonai, these very famous songs that we still sing on our Shabbat table to this very day, both in Ashkenazi and in Sephardi communities. And these people spent some time in the land of Israel, in Tzfat, and in other cities. I believe one of them was even the rabbi in Gaza, in Aza, which also had a Jewish community. But they also moved in the middle of the 16th century. They both lived around 1550. They both moved to Damascus and settled there for many decades. Rabbi Najara, I believe, was born in Damascus. Before we skip forward to 1948, we have to mention another influx of Jews coming in from Europe in the 18th century. Jews coming in from Italy, merchants, and from France. And these Jews were known to the local Jews, to the previous Jews living there, as the Francos, meaning European Jews. And they brought with them all of these European influences. So even before modernity, right, and modern education entered Syria in a serious way in the 19th century through schools like Alliance that we met last time in Iraq, even before Western education was introduced, there were already significant Jewish communities of Western Jews coming into Syria. One of those Jewish families was the Hasson family that we'll talk about in a minute. The Hasson family, which came from Spain, they tracked their origins to Spain, moved to Livorno in Italy, and from there to Saida or Sidon in Lebanon. According to one of the members of the family, Avraham Chasson, who we'll see in a minute, the family arrived from Lebanon to Damascus in Syria in 1860 and settled in Harat el-Yahud, the Jewish neighborhood of Damascus, where they became quite wealthy and built a very large house. Avraham Chasson, who I interviewed, says that he was born and raised in the same house where his grandfather, Shahada, also was born and built. He was born in Damascus, and he built the family house, which also had a synagogue inside. So it was quite a wealthy family. Avraham, who was born in 1942 in Damascus, went to the Alliance School, so he studied French alongside Arabic and Hebrew, Jewish studies, and he was one of 10 siblings. His father was an accountant working for the Ministry of Finance in Syria, and they lived in a very tight-knit community, which Avraham describes as living from Shabbat to Shabbat, meaning planning the meals and the community life of the following week from week to week. Quite a tight-knit community, studying in local schools, mostly with members of their own community, but interacting with neighbors who were Muslim around them. So when Avraham was 6 years old, the number of Syrian Jews was around 40,000. But let's hear the story now of Avraham Chasson as he describes the eve of his departure from Syria, which took place in 1962, so almost 60 years ago. And he describes the history that Jews attributed to the synagogue, the ancient synagogue in Jobar, one of the suburbs of Damascus. So let's watch how he describes that. Let me try. Okay.
جوبر بالتاريخ الماضي كانت ضيعة أغلبيتها يهود، لأنه بجوبر في مغارة تحت الأرض. حسب العقيدة اليهودية الخضر الياهو، النبي الياهو الخضر بيسموه بالعربي، كان يهرب من الملك أحاب ومرته إيزابل، كان يهرب منهم ويتخبى بهالمغارة. مشان هالأشياء ومذكور المطرح بكتاب الأنبياء، كان يعني المكان مقدس. أنا كنت مؤمن بهالمكان، يعني البرهان إنه وقت اللي قررنا إنه نهرب من الشام رحت لهناك وصليت وشعلت قنديل وقريت يعني من الزامور، قريت منه. هي يعني عقيدتنا إنه الله بيساعدنا.
So that's the story that Avraham Chasson told me about the eve of his departure, just before smugglers took him and his brother across the border north to Turkey, where he fled through the help of the Israeli embassy to Israel. He was about 20 years old at the time and had studied 1 or 2 years of physics in university back in Damascus, subsequently continuing his studies here in Israel and completing a PhD in physics at the Technion. So both he and his brothers did quite well in Israel after their migration, after their aliyah to Israel. One of them became a member of Knesset, Israel Chasson, and a security official. The other was one of my lecturers at Hebrew University, Yitzhak Chasson, a professor of Arabic literature and language. So the family did quite well for itself after it moved to Israel. I brought that video first in order to show sort of, well, not the heyday of Syrian Jews, because none of the Jews that are alive today could really tell us how great things were under the French Mandate or under the Ottoman Empire before World War I. But there were already cases of persecution and anti-Semitism even in previous centuries. So the famous Damascus affair that took place in 1840 was basically a blood libel where the Christians accused the Jews of killing a monk, Father Thomas, and using his blood for matzah. So it was a classic anti-Semitic blood libel from the European style, but propagated by Christians living in Syria at the time. Let's not forget that the country Lebanon, that was designated later by the French to become a separate country for the Christians, didn't exist yet. So at this time when we talk about Syria, right, in the 19th century, as a country, we're talking both about what is today Syria and what is today Lebanon. In the 20th century, even before Zionism established the State of Israel and before the partition decision passed in the UN, a pogrom occurred in 1925 as a result of the rise of Syrian anti-French nationalism. This is right within the framework of the fight of the Arab nationalists, who also helped, get rid of the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. They also fought French control and the French mandate in those years. And anti-French sentiment came with anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish attacks as well, and a mob ransacked the Jewish quarter in Damascus. 20 years later, or 22 years later, when the partition plan passed in the UN, things got really bad for the Jews of Syria. Syria had just won its independence in 1946 from the French. Things were very unstable in terms of government and control of these very weak prime ministers over the population. That's possibly one of the reasons why Syria was so eager to join the war against the nascent Israel, because the populations were pushing for it, pushing to join the war, and the leaders couldn't really prevent them or stop them from doing that. But in that time around the War of Independence, synagogues were attacked in the city of Damascus. And one of the famous, notorious attacks that happened was a grenade attack against the Menashe synagogue in Damascus in 1948. And one of the Israeli Syrian Jews I interviewed, Meir Mishan, an Israeli diplomat who made Aliyah from Syria as a young teenager following that attack, told me about the experience he had as a survivor of that attack. He actually prayed on that Tisha B'Av, on that day of fast in Damascus when the attack took place, and remembers it to this day. So maybe we'll go forward and watch the video and then talk about the years subsequently.
الحادث الثاني اللي كان يعني أصعب حصل بعد كان بآخر الصيف أو آخر أيام الصيف بعد الصوم اللي من 70 آب كان بليلة السبت. ليلة السبت كنا بالكنيسة المنشة بالحارة، في كنيستين كبار، واحدة اسمها فرنج واحدة اسمها المنشة. بالمنشة كنا عم نصلي، فلحشوا قنبلتين أو 3 قنبلتين يدوية. أنا كنت داخل الكنيسة، حشوها مو داخل جوا إلا بالحوش. الكنيسة كانت ملانة مصلين، فكنا جماعة أولاد تبع المدرسة كنا بنقرأ مزامير التهليم اللي قبل الصلاة. فكان هيجان كبير، وأنا أبي مسكني بإيدي، أخذني بإيدي ورحنا طالعين بسرعة برا، وعدينا على جثث اللي كانوا ملحوشين على الأرض، ما عدا اللي كانوا مجروحين وكذا. وقتها بعدين عرفنا إنه كان في بين 10 ل 13 مصابين، يعني ميتين. وأبي مسكني وأخذني على البيت، يعني بسرعة رحنا على البيت. فوقتها بالبيت بذات الليل أخذوا القرار إنه رايحين نطلع، يعني ما مش ممكن نبقى نضل بهالمدينة بهالمكان. كان لازم نطلع على بيروت وطريق البحر، نجي طريق البحر. فمنشان ما كان ممكن ناخذ معنا أي حاجة، فأمي لبستنا طبقة على طبقة، يعني قمصانين واحد على الثاني أو 2 بنطلونات وكذا حاجات. وما عدا ذلك لما طلعنا على الباص، بالباص عطتنا مسكة، يعني شوكولات، انه نلعس مسكة. ليش نلعس مسكة؟ حتى ما نفتح تمنا ونحكي، مشان اذا بدينا نحكي بيعرفوا على الحال انه نحن يهود. ويهود شو بيساووا بالباص ومسافرين لبيروت؟ بنص البحر فجأة كانت تدخل مية على بدأت تدخل مية على القارب. فصاحب القارب أعطانا كاسات وزي نطلع المية على البحر. وهيك الرجال اللي كانوا هنيك بالقارب كانوا يعني بيقروا تهليم وبيصلوا حتى وصلنا يعني بالسلامة. لما وصلنا كان طلع الفجر.
لوين وصلتوا؟
وصلنا لمكان اسمه أخزيف. أخزيف دي كان في كبوتس اسمه جيش رزيف. لما وصلنا القارب ما وقف يعني قبل 100 متر من الشط. فالناس تبع الكبوتس نزلت على المية واخذ لنا على اكتافهم او على ظهرهم للكبوتس.
وهي كانت اي سنة؟
كانت 49، كان اغسطس 1949.
وانت عمرك كان قديش؟
10 سنين. اشتغلت بوزارة الخارجية، خدمت بتركيا، خدمت بهايتي، خدمت بمكسيك. أنا كنت أنصل عام بالإسكندرية، كان في هناك جالية يهودية، وأنا كنت بصلي لهم يعني وبقرا لهم بالتوراة. هناك كنا أحيانا بنروح على المغارة تبع النبي الياهو، وهنيك كنا بنجي عشان نصلي، واللي كانوا بيطلبوا طلبات واللي كانوا بيردوا الشفا على واحد اللي كانوا عيان، ومنشعل شمع. لحد اليوم أن ريحة الشمع لسه بأنفي.
So that dramatic story of escape from Syria to Israel is quite moving, I find. But many other Syrian Jews who left later tell similar stories of smuggling and of escape, sometimes with hidden identities, sometimes through Lebanon, sometimes through Turkey. Meir Mishan, who, as he explained, was a diplomat in the Foreign Service in Israel, told me at the beginning of that interview that he wished one day to go back to Syria as Israel's first ambassador in Syria. So you have that mix of pain, of sadness over the fact that Jews could no longer live in Syria as equal citizens and be safe and be guarded by the governments. But at the same time, this nostalgia for many things that existed there, especially the Jewish relics, the synagogue of Eliyahu and Navi, or the festivals, and so on. When we talk about the downturn of Syrian Jews, and again, Meir Mishan is one of the earlier waves of Jews to leave Syria, soon after the establishment of Israel. But in 1961, the military coup took place, followed by the capture of Israeli spy Eli Cohen in 1965. In 1963, the Ba'ath party took over Syria, this secular nationalist party, which on the one hand protected minorities, like the Jews, like the Christians, like the Alawites, the Druze, all these religious minorities that lived in Syria, but on the other hand established a very, very harsh dictatorship governed by military personalities from 1970. That was Hafiz Assad, and of course from the year 2000 his son Bashar al-Assad, and we know how that turned out for the Syrians, unfortunately, today. A regime that might have been more favorable to minorities ended up being a very ruthless, terrible regime for all Syrians, as we saw in recent years. So in those early years, of course, following the Eli Cohen affair, and in the 70s, through the 80s, and finally the last wave of Syrian Jews to leave when Hafiz Assad allowed the exodus of the last Jews of the communities of Aleppo and Damascus in 1992 or the early 90s. Today, very, very few Jews remain in Syria, probably less than 10. The agreement was that in the 90s they leave to the United States. That was the condition under which Assad, the father, allowed Syrian Jews to leave. So most of them didn't come to Israel, but actually went to the United States, where they live today. Now let's move on to the second country we want to talk about today, and that's Egypt. The Jewish community in Egypt, as the other communities we mentioned, dates back millennia, and this community dates back to the First Temple period. Many Jews moved to Egypt from the land of Israel during the Ptolemaic period, that same period where there was persecution coming in from the north, which we mentioned before when we spoke about Syria and Antiochus. So a lot of the Jews in the land of Israel actually fled southward towards the other Hellenistic empire that existed at the time, and that was the Ptolemaic Empire in those centuries before the Common Era. Even earlier than that, the Jews of Yeb, right, this military outpost island, existed where Jews lived. So we have very, very early mentions of Jews living in Egypt. And of course, the Jews in Egypt maintained a close contact with the yeshivot, those big religious centers of Babylon, of Bavel that we mentioned last time. Rabbi Saadia Gaon, right, one of the series of rabbis, of prominent rabbis known as the Geonim, right, that period of a few centuries following the Talmudic era. And Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who lived between 882 and 942 CE, is also known in the Arab world as Sa'id al-Fayyumi, or Rabbi Saadia Gaon of Fayyum, a city in the Nile Delta in Egypt. And he moved eastward from Egypt through the land of Israel and eventually settled in Babylon to serve there. The Fatimid dynasty which started in the year 969 in Egypt. The Fatimid dynasty was a Shia dynasty, not a Sunni dynasty, that moved eastward from North Africa, the area of Tunisia today, and took over Egypt in the year 969, was a relatively tolerant regime or empire towards the Jews. And also the following dynasty, the Ayyubid dynasty of Saladin, those were tolerant dynasties for the Jews. Rabbi Moses Maimonides, the famous Rambam, came to Egypt in the year 1165 and became a court doctor, an important community leader. Of course, we have to remember that Maimonides fled eastward from those countries in North Africa, first from Spain, and then from those countries in North Africa that had more harsh dynasties, more oppressive dynasties, and he finally found rest and a royal court position as a doctor and community leader in Cairo. Approximately 25,000 Jews lived in Egypt at that time when he was a community leader. And Maimonides, of course, corresponded with Jews of other areas. And we can't mention, like Yemen, which we mentioned last week, and we can't, of course, mention or talk about the Jews of Egypt in the Middle Ages or medieval Jews without mentioning, of course, the famous Cairo Geniza, that treasure trove of hundreds of thousands of documents that was found in the Ibn Ezra synagogue, that ancient synagogue in the old town of Cairo, Fustat, in the 19th century. Documents and relics and fragments of discarded documents, from marriage certificates to business contracts to other religious artifacts dating from the 6th century all the way to the 19th century. So hundreds and hundreds of years of historic documentation found in the attic of the Ibn Ezra synagogue, and giving us a wonderful insight today for researchers to know about life not just in Egypt, but all across the Jewish world, from North Africa to the Middle East. And of course, that was preserved in Cairo and is a testament to the fact that Jews lived there throughout all those centuries and had thriving Jewish communities. Still in the Middle Ages, though, the harsh Mamluk dynasty caused the community to dwindle. This is 14th, 15th centuries. And by the end of the 15th century, just 500 Jews remained in Egypt. So there was a very, very low point. Of course, we have to remember that when we talk about the Jews of Egypt, we're not just talking about rabbinic Jews, but also, of course, of the Karaite community, that community of Jews that believed exclusively in the written Torah and didn't accept rabbinic commentary. And of course, Maimonides and others wrote about the relations with the Karaite Jews. In some points in history, the Karaites actually outnumbered the rabbinic Jews in Egypt. So they were very numerous, but slowly their numbers dwindled as well. The Ottoman Empire didn't remain in Egypt as long as it did in Syria, which we just mentioned, because in 1805, an independent Egyptian dynasty took control of Egypt, and that was the dynasty headed first by Mehmet Ali, or Muhammad Ali, in 1805. And the community was revived at that point. And that was the same monarchy that actually ruled Egypt all the way into the 1940s, and even 1952, when finally the officers' revolution took place and Nasser came to power. In 1840, Sir Moses Montefiore and Adolphe Crémieux introduced general education, meaning secular education, and secularism spread, and French became the language of the community. Just as we saw in Syria, Jews went to French schools, and even in Iraq, Jews sometimes studied French. The same was the case in Egypt. During the early 20th century, Italian and Ashkenazi communities were founded in Cairo. Alexandria became business centers and cultural centers that drew Jews from Europe. So not just Sephardi Jews lived, or Oriental Jews, Middle Eastern Jews, but also European Jews moved into Egypt. and Jews thrived in business and culture during the first half of the 20th century. Big department stores and shops that were owned by Jews, business people that were Jewish. So Jews really did thrive until more or less the middle of the 20th century. A few years ago in Silver Spring, Maryland, I met Marcel Shalom. Marcel Shalom was born, I think, in 1947. And in this interview, she tells me of the story of the downturn of her community, the community of Cairo, the Jews of Cairo, and the sadness to see all of her family and relatives leave in the 1940s until the real crisis happened in the early 50s, following Nasser's climb to power, and then the big crisis with the West in the Sinai campaign, 1956. So here's Marcel Shalom today, living in Silver Spring, Maryland, telling me about the atmosphere that she experienced as a young teenager before leaving Egypt in 1961. Sorry.
أنا كنت صغيرة لكن أسمع وأشوف أبويا يسمع راديو فري يوروب ويقول دلوقتي الخدامين يقعدوا في المطبخ ما يجوش برا. لكن إحنا كبرنا وما فيش وفي الخوف ما تحكيش ما تقولش اللي تسمعه في البيت ما تقولش حاجة. عشان إحنا أبويا وجدي كان عنده جنسية مصرية سنة 56 ما طردوناش. بس كل الأهل بتوع أمي اللي كان عندهم جنسية فرنسوية ولا عندهم جنسية إنجليزية بعد 56 طردوهم. قالوا إن أنتوا خطر على البلد، إن أنتوا مش عايزينكم هنا.
Like a bird on a tree.
So Marcel Shalom tells me that a part of her family was actually banished from Egypt in 1956 because they didn't hold Egyptian citizenship. They were French citizens, which in one sense gave them protection from local courts if anything went wrong. But on the other hand, when things really got bad for the Jews, they could simply be deported as foreign nationals. Marcel's grandfather came from Yemen, so Marcel and her father had Egyptian citizenship, so they weren't banished at that point. But following 1956, she told me that her father's assets in the bank were frozen following the war, and slowly it became impossible for them to live normal lives in Egypt until in 1961 they were forced out of the country and had to sign basically a waiver giving up their citizenship. Every Jew getting only $50 and being given a week, I think, to leave, and that was the end of their presence in Egypt, even as citizens in Egypt. But even before then, in the Great Arab Revolt, which happened here in the land of Israel, or Mandate Palestine in 1936, 1939, against the British, that affected the Jewish community in Egypt, which was also still controlled by the British at that point. And of course, following the partition vote and the establishment of Israel, we're talking now about November 1947, Jewish employment was limited by the government. Bombings and riots claimed at least 70 lives of Jews. And by 1950, nearly 40% of the community, numbering 75 to 80,000, had already left Egypt. So now we're talking not even about the revolutionary stage of Egypt's history that started, as I said, in 1952 with Nasser's officers' revolt. But even before then, around Zionism, the central government was too weak and too passive, even during the monarchy, to stop these attacks against the Jews. And Marcel Shalom describes how gradually her family members left. In 1948, there was an attack against the synagogue with bombs, and things got increasingly scary. And she describes this dual attack, or this dual threat on both sides. First from the Muslim Brotherhood, which already in the 1940s was targeting Jews. And the Muslim Brotherhood was, of course, created in the 1920s, the late 1920s, in Egypt. That was where it started. So you had this political Islamism that was gaining power in the 30s and 40s. And then in the 1950s, of course, the nationalist rhetoric of Nasser, who had returned to Egypt following the War of Independence or the War of 1948, disillusioned with his government in Egypt and finally gained enough power to overthrow that government. And he was really disillusioned with the fact that they weren't given enough resources and arms to fight the Zionists, to fight the nascent Israeli state. And a lot of that pent-up frustration, of course, was later, I guess, spent on the Jews of Egypt in oppressive and discriminatory ways, which Marcel Shalom describes here. And it became gradually more difficult following the Sinai campaign or the Sinai War and the subsequent years after that. By 1967, just 2,500 Jews remained in Egypt. And when the Six-Day War broke out, that was probably the last low point where all Jewish men were arrested and were released and expelled, many of them from the country in 1970. There still remained a Jewish community post-1970, and in a moment we'll see a video of a member of that community in the very, very last years of the Jewish presence in Egypt, but it was minuscule and negligible. The synagogues had gradually, 15 synagogues that existed in Cairo, gradually shut down one after the other, and life became very, very limited for the Jews. Suddenly, though, there was a bright point at the end of the 1970s when President Sadat signed the peace accords with Israel, and that suddenly brought a new stage in positivity between Israel and Egypt, and positively affected the remaining Jews living in Alexandria and in Cairo, but the numbers were so small at that point. A few years ago, I happened to meet in a TV studio in Jerusalem a reporter working for the Arabic service of Israel's national broadcaster, Kan, sitting next to me at a TV studio and speaking this fluent, flowery, beautiful Egyptian dialect. And after the interview, or after the discussion in the studio, I came to him and said, "What's your story? How come you speak such great Egyptian Arabic? It's very unusual for Jews to speak." Of his age, he didn't seem too old to speak such great Arabic. And he told me his story. And of course, I rushed to interview him in his home in Jerusalem. And here's the story of one of the last remaining Jews of Egypt, Yosef Dana, whose father was the head of the Jewish community in Cairo. So here's his story.
اسمي ميخائيل دانا، أنا من مواليدي القاهرة، مصر طبعا. جيت إسرائيل سنة 80 بعد معاهدة السلام. طبعا معروف السادات جه سنة 77 إسرائيل، 79 كان معاهدة كامب ديفيد. سنة بعد كده تقريبا جينا لإسرائيل، كان عمري تقريبا 14 سنة، كنت في ثالثة إعدادي. اللي حصل إني خالي كان من مواليد مصر وكان في معتقل في مصر، رجع مصر لزيارة طبعا بعد معاهدة السلام، يزور والدتي الله يرحمها اللي هي أخته، وابتدى يقنع والدي ووالدتي إن لازم نيجي إسرائيل، على أساس إن طبعا ما فضلش ناس في مصر، ما فضلش يهود تقريبا. عددنا في مصر كان في حدود 100 نفر في القاهرة وكمان 100 في اسكندرية. طبعا ما فيش المدارس اليهودية بتاعت زمان، ما فيش كل التعليم اليهودي وهكذا. وطبعا في واحد عايز يتجوز بعد كده، ما فيش حتى ما فضلش بنات الواحد يتجوزهم. ففي الآخر أقنعهم على أساس إني بالقليل يبعت الولاد اللي هنا. أنا بكلم عليا وعلى كمان 4 إخواتي. سنة 88 والدي الله يرحمه توفى. والدي يوسف دانا كان رئيس الطائفة الإسرائيلية، كان اسمها الطائفة الإسرائيلية ومش اليهودية. أيام مصر زمان الإسرائيلي هو اليهودي، يعني مش إسرائيلي كجنسية، مش القومية أو الوطنية، إنما كلمة إسرائيلي بمعنى يهودية. فكان رئيس الطائفة الإسرائيلية ومحامي في شغله. اتوفى، جبناه هنا يدفن في إسرائيل. طبعا عشان منصبه كان لازم تصريحات مخصوصة لحد من وزارة وزير الداخلية في مصر. جبناه هنا ووالدتي جت تسكن هنا من ساعتها. اضطريت ارجع كمان مرة لمصر سنتين، يعني من لما خلصت هنا دراستي من 88 ل 90 تقريبا رجعت أعيش في مصر عشان أخلص كل الأمور بتاعتنا هناك، شقة ومشاغل ومكتب والدي الله يرحمه محامي وهكذا. قعدت كمان سنتين، في آخر السنتين رجعت كمان مرة إسرائيل وجوزت هنا وخلفت الحمد لله، عندي عيلة.
Like a bird on a tree.
So maybe here we do have somewhat of a positive tone at the end of that story, because thanks to the peace agreements between Israel and Egypt, the Camp David peace accords, someone like Michael Dana, and I apologize, the name is Michael, Yosef is his father, the head of the community, someone like Michael Dana could go back and forth, and he describes taking the bus in the 80s down the coastal road, across the Suez Canal and into Cairo and going back and forth, and he even lived in Cairo again in the late 1980s, as he says. So things did seem normal for a while. Of course, the Arab Spring and the tumultuous times we had in recent decades, of course, affected by the Palestinian conflict, also affected Israel's position there. And today there are very, very few Jews left in Egypt, probably less than 10. So to summarize what we've said in the last two sessions, the first one dealing with Iraq and Yemen, and today talking about Syria and Egypt. In general, we can say that the experience of Jews in these countries fluctuated between dynasties, between different periods in history. In general, we can say that the Jews fared much better under imperialism, under the rule of the British or the French, or even under the Ottoman Empire, which had this millet system that allowed communities to function somewhat independently. When these countries received independence, soon before Israel came into existence, things got much worse for the Jews living in these countries, both because of the rise of Arab nationalism in these countries, and of course because of the effect that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict had on the domestic politics of these countries. And we can see this in all four of the countries we spoke about. That's it for today. I'm very happy to go back and take a few questions. I know we don't have much time, but I'm happy to take one or two questions. So, Tamar?
Thank you very much, Elhanan. So we have a question from Barbara, who said that she heard that the Egyptian government has recently restored synagogues. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, that is true. The Alexandria synagogue, and I apologize to the Jews of Alexandria and to the Jews of Aleppo, who I didn't talk about today. Very important communities. It's just not the Jews that I interviewed as much. Egypt is now putting in a huge amount of effort and money into restoring synagogues, especially in Alexandria. I think it's called Eliyahu Navi Synagogue in Alexandria. I haven't visited, but I hear it's beautiful. I know people who visited the opening of that last year or the year before. And I think some of it has to do with tourism. Some of it has to do with pro-American sentiments that President Sisi wants to convey to the United States administration. Very little to do with the Jewish community today, which doesn't really have a need for a big, beautiful synagogue, unfortunately.
That actually reminds us of maybe synagogues being restored in Poland without communities around there.
Right. Morocco is still a country that is restoring. Maybe we'll talk about that next week.
Okay. Sonia wants to know why French Jews went to Syria.
Why French Jews went to Syria? I think maybe the opposite is true. Why Syrian Jews went to France, possibly. Okay. So Syria was under the French mandate. Right, the British and the French carved up the territories of the Ottoman Empire during World War I in the Sykes-Picot agreements, and the French controlled Lebanon and Syria. So Syria was under French influence for quite a few decades post-World War I, and of course the Jewish schools, Alliance that we mentioned before, taught French. So there were really strong French influences on the Jews of Syria for many decades, probably a century or more. And that's why one of the natural places for Jews to go was France, maybe more Lebanon when Jews went there. But it's true also that a lot of Jews from Syria left to Latin America, Central America, New York. So I wouldn't say that France was actually the #1 destination, although there still are a lot of cultural influences, French influences on the Jews of Syria.
Okay, we'll take one or two last questions. Do you think there will ever be any compensation for Jews who lost their assets in these Arab countries?
I don't think so. I think a lot of these countries are allowing Jews, not necessarily Syria, but some of these countries are allowing Jews to reclaim their citizenship and come back. There are talks about that. I visited Morocco a few years ago, where actually entire sections of cities like Sawira, where Jews used to live, are still being maintained and the property is being held for the Jews. I'm not sure what the case is in Syria. A lot of Syrian Muslims comment actually on my videos and say that there are houses that are being safeguarded. Unfortunately, the war really damaged a lot of Jewish sites in Syria, especially the synagogues. Some of them have really been badly damaged, according to the reports. I don't really think Syria is in a place to compensate Jews that left. It hardly has enough money for its own citizens. Same goes for Iraq, same goes for Yemen. I find it hard to believe that they'll ever get any compensation.
And do we know who is actually looking after the Jewish sites that remain in Aleppo and Damascus? That's Amir's question.
I'm not sure. In some cases, I think it's the government, but I think some of them are just abandoned buildings. I don't think there's any official guardians that are doing that. I did visit Cairo, and in Cairo, the police is guarding the synagogues. Most of them are closed for visits. It's really very difficult to enter any of the synagogues. This was at least the case before the Arab Spring when I was there. The Eliyahu Navi synagogue, the Ibn Ezra synagogue, where I mentioned the Cairo Gniza was found, is a tourist site. It's a museum, and you can enter there, but it's not a place of worship. It's just a museum, and I don't think that any of the other synagogues are open for visitors, as far as I know.
Okay, so this is the last question. Do you know what has happened to documents and records recently discovered in a new Gniza in Egypt, thrown into the trash by Egypt?
I'm not sure what that refers to. I know that when the Cairo Gniza was found, a lot of it was shipped out to universities across the world, to Oxford.
I think this is a question regarding something more recent, but it's okay.
I have no knowledge of that, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Elhanan. This was a fascinating session, and next week we'll be in Morocco and Iran, so you're all welcome to join us.
Tunisia.
Sorry, sorry, because it's my mistake. That's not even part of the Arab world. And for many of you ask, we upload all our events and also Elhanan's lectures on our website. So you should be getting a link to them also from the webinar. And you can also look them up on our website if you want to make up whatever you missed. Thank you very much, Elhanan, and see you everybody next week.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.